My brother walked into our father's $340 million boardroom, sat at the head of the table, and handed me a termination letter. Like 11 years of my life meant nothing. 43 people watched it happen. Not one spoke. What Marcus never considered, not for a single second, was that I had personally financed the debt attached to every property he just received. The towers, the hotels, the warehouses, the land. He thought he won. Not once did he stop to consider what he had actually just stepped into. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from, because this story was made for you. Floor 47 had windows that ran from the floor to the ceiling. Every single morning, before anyone else arrived, my father would stand at those windows. He would look out at the city, the streets, the buildings, the skyline he had spent 30 years constructing piece by piece, and say the same thing without variation. We build that, Ethan, every morning. Remind yourself of that. He meant it as fuel. Standing in that room on October 14th, I understood it as something else entirely. Marcus sat at the head of the table, our father's chair, our father's company, our father's watch on his wrist, a 1962 Rolex Datejust that Raymond Calloway had worn every single day for 4 decades and had promised Moritan Once to the son who kept this place alive. That watch caught my eye the moment Marcus walked through the door. I do not believe he realized I had noticed. 43 people filled the room around us. Senior partners, attorneys, staff members who had received a calendar invitation that morning with no agenda listed, no explanation offered, just a time and a floor number. Every one of them had arrived without knowing what this gathering was about. Some had worked here longer than I had. Some had joined the same year I did, and we had grown into this company side by side over a decade. Around the table they sat with the particular stillness of people who can feel that something significant is occurring but have not yet been told which side of it they are standing on. David Halley occupied the seat at the far end. 22 years. That was how long David Halley had been my father's attorney. Every major contract this company had ever signed passed through his hands, present at every significant moment in Calloway Group's history. The acquisitions, the disputes, the expansions, the difficult years when the portfolio nearly collapsed in 2009, and Raymond had called him at 2 a.m., and they had worked through until sunrise. David Halley was not a man who looked away from hard things. In 11 years of working alongside him, I had never once seen him avoid a difficult moment. These morning his eyes were fixed on the wall somewhere above my head. He would not look at me. That was the moment I understood, not what was about to happen. I had felt that coming for days, the way you feel weather changing before the clouds arrive. What landed in that specific moment was the understanding that whatever was unfolding had already been decided before anyone entered this room. The meeting was not a negotiation. It was a notification. Across 40 feet of Italian marble, Marcus slid a folder. Slowly it traveled that distance and came to rest in front of me like something being delivered to a person who had not been invited to the dinner but had been permitted to receive the bill. Ethan. His voice was warm, practiced in the way warmth becomes a tool when it is deployed instead of felt. Dad wanted both of us taken care of. That package contains 2 years of salary, full benefits, continuation, and an equity stake in the residential division. My eyes moved to the folder. Then I looked at him. An equity stake in the division one had personally built from 4 properties to 61 over 7 years. The division that currently represented 40% of this company's total portfolio value. 11 years of 5 a.m. mornings and missed birthdays and weekends spent reading lease agreements, compressed into a line item in a severance document, and pushed across 40 feet of marble by a man wearing our dead father's watch. The board and I agree that the company needs unified leadership now, Marcus continued. One voice. One direction. A pause, and in that pause, something moved across his face that might have been genuine discomfort or might have been the careful performance of it. Deep down, I think you already know this is the right decision. Nobody spoke. Not one of those 43 people looked at me directly, except Marcus. 3 full seconds of silence. In that silence, I thought about the refinancing deal I had structured at 24 years old, 17 problematic clauses, 3 competing lenders. A closing that collapsed once before it finally held that freed up $8.4 million in capital. Raymond used to acquire a Northern District property, now worth $31 million. I thought about the memo I had submitted 8 months ago flagging to commercial tenant termination risks, which Marcus had acknowledged receiving and then filed without action. I thought about every morning, every missed event. Every moment I had chosen this building over everything else because I genuinely believed, without performance or calculation, that what we were constructing together was worth that sacrifice. 3 seconds. Up from the chair. Jacket on. No open folder. No raised voice. No expression worth quoting. No gesture worth remembering. Middle button first, the way my father had shown me at 14. Then the lower, never the top. One door. One quiet click as it closed. Behind me, 43 people sat in a stillness so absolute you could hear the traffic 47 floors below. What Marcus did not know, what nobody in that room understood, was that the folder he had slid across the table was not the most consequential document in play that morning. 73 other pages existed. Every one of them carried my name. But that comes later. Stay with me first. To understand what Ethan Callaway held in those 73 pages, you need to understand who Raymond Callaway actually was. Not the version in the business journals. The real version. Born with nothing. No inherited money. No family name that unlocked rooms. No network handed to him at birth. Raymond grew up in a 2-bedroom house in the Eastern District, the son of a man who drove delivery trucks 6 days a week and a woman who took in clothing alterations on the kitchen table to help cover the shortfall. What Raymond had was a neighborhood, a relentless work ethic, and one idea he carried from the time he was 19 years old and which never left him. Real estate does not disappear. Businesses fail. Products become obsolete. Markets collapse. Land remains. Buildings remain. The physical world persists in a way that other assets cannot. Raymond understood this, not from a business school lecture, but from watching his father exhaust himself for a weekly paycheck that never quite reached far enough, and he made a decision very early that he was going to be someone who owned things rather than someone who only worked for people who did. In 1987, at 31 years old, Raymond borrowed $340,000 against a small warehouse he had bought with 6 years of accumulated savings and used that capital to purchase a second property, 2 blocks away in the same industrial district. Borrowed against the second to acquire a third. The third financed a fourth. By 1992, he owned 7 properties. By 1995, 11. By 2001, 23. By the time Marcus and Ethan were old enough to sit at dinner and genuinely understand what their father did during the hours, they did not see him. Raymond Callaway controlled a real estate portfolio spanning 3 states, employing over 200 people, and generating annual revenue that had begun attracting serious attention from the business press. Warm. He was not. That needs to be said plainly because it matters to everything that follows. Birthdays were acknowledged, without ceremony. School events were attended when the schedule allowed, which was perhaps half the time. Dinner table conversation covered interest rates. Neighborhood transitions, which markets were rising and which were showing early signs of stress. Raymond did not ask his sons how they felt about things. He asked them what they thought about things. A distinction that sounds minor but produces entirely different kinds of people. Consistent, though, without exception. Every morning before any employee arrived, and every evening after the last one had gone. Present for the hard negotiations and the failed acquisitions in the years when the entire portfolio teetered, and nobody outside the company knew how close it had come to unraveling. Raymond showed up in the way that actually builds something consistently, without requiring acknowledgement, without needing anyone to notice or record it. Both his sons watched this. They took away different things from what they saw. Marcus absorbed the exterior, the bearing, the authority, the specific gravity of a person who has learned to occupy space with complete confidence. By the time Marcus was in his mid-20s, strangers who met him assumed he had been raised to inherit something: Raymond's jaw, his mother's social ease, and a quality that cannot be manufactured in most people: the ability to walk into any room and make every person there feel like the most significant one present. Investors responded to him. Journalists found him compelling. Business contacts, who had resisted Raymond for years, opened to Marcus across a single dinner. Ethan absorbed the interior. Contracts. Mechanics. The invisible, unglamorous system running beneath everything polished and visible. While Marcus attended industry dinners and gave the kind of toasts rooms, remember, Ethan was at his desk working through refinancing agreements, while Marcus's photograph appeared in business publications alongside quotes about vision and growth. Ethan was on the phone at 7 a.m. with lenders in different time zones, quietly dismantling problems that would have become crises if left another week. Nobody writes about the crises that never happen. Raymond saw both his sons clearly, more clearly, perhaps, than either of them understood. Behind the compressed sentences and the relentless focus on outcomes, Raymond saw his children not as they presented themselves, but as they actually were. Marcus, he loved the way you love something brilliant and beautiful that you also feel a persistent, quiet anxiety about, proud of the brightness, aware of how brightness can attract the wrong kind of attention. Ethan, he trusted the way you trust the ground under a building you have spent your life constructing. Without announcement, without ceremony, with the specific, settled confidence of someone who has tested the foundation many times and found it solid every single time. The central failure that set every subsequent event in motion, was that Raymond never said any of this to either of them directly. Genuine trust. Genuine love. Yet Raymond was a man formed by a particular generation and temperament. And in that formation, the most important things were shown rather than spoken. He carried the assumption, as people with his nature so often fatally do, that showing was sufficient. It was not sufficient. One conversation between Raymond and Ethan took place behind a closed door on a Tuesday evening in June that no one else ever heard. One set of questions answered honestly because there was no time left for anything else. That conversation is the structural reason this story ends the way it does. We are not there yet. Carry it with you, because when we arrive, every piece of what came before will lock into place. 24 years old. That was Ethan's age the first time he restructured a major debt instrument for Callaway Group. The work was not interesting to describe. 14-hour days across 3 weeks. 3 lenders with conflicting requirements. A refinancing agreement containing 17 flawed clauses at varying levels of severity. A closing that collapsed entirely once before it finally held on a Thursday afternoon in November, when every person in the room was exhausted and nobody had any interest in marking the occasion. When it finished, $8.4 million in capital had been freed. Raymond deployed that capital to acquire a commercial property in the Northern District that had attracted no competing bids because its surface presentation signaled problems, and most buyers in that market stopped at the surface. That property is currently valued at $31 million. No article appeared about the refinancing that made the acquisition possible. Marcus attended the acquisition dinner and delivered a toast that drew genuine laughter and applause. Because Marcus gave toasts the way other people held conversations, without visible effort, without apparent preparation, as naturally as breathing. This was the operating pattern for 7 years. Ethan built and maintained the machinery. Marcus represented it to the world. Ethan told himself, with the specific, deliberate repetition of someone talking themselves into a position, that this was fine, that results were what mattered, that visibility was vanity, that the work was sufficient in itself. Approximately 60% of him believed that. The remaining 40% accumulated quietly in a place he did not examine. Marcus was not a villain during those years. This matters and needs stating directly, because stories structured like this one invite a particular kind of flattening the clear hero, the obvious antagonist, the moral verdict available from the opening line. Real circumstances resist that simplicity. And these circumstances were no different. Genuine care existed between them. In rooms Ethan was never present for, Marcus spoke about his brother with specific pride. Investors were told, accurately, that the residential division's consistent performance was attributable entirely to Ethan's ability to identify undervalued assets and his discipline in managing them over time. On multiple occasions, Marcus pushed Raymond to formalize Ethan's contributions with greater title, greater visibility, greater acknowledgement of the credit that plainly belonged to him. Raymond would nod and say he would consider it. Rarely did he act. Eventually, Marcus stopped raising the subject. Not from any deliberate choice to keep his brother in the background, but from the gradual, unexamined acceptance that certain arrangements in this family were simply fixed, and pressing against them produced only friction without result. From any external vantage point, this acceptance is indistinguishable from indifference. Ethan read it as indifference. Between them 4 years, that misreading sat without either of them naming it, gathering density, the way unaddressed things do. March. Raymond's diagnosis arrived. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3, the oncologist, offered a range of 8 to 14 months, delivered directly at Raymond's explicit request, because Raymond had specified he wanted information rather than softening. 9 months was all he lasted. In those 9 months, Raymond Calloway changed in a way that surprised the people who thought they knew him completely. The man who had spent 3 decades showing everything and stating nothing began, for the first time in his life, to speak, not about the business, about the space underneath it, about decisions that had seemed necessary at the time and what they had actually cost in the years since, about Marcus and a specific fear he had carried for years, that his older son's considerable social gifts had never been tested by sustained difficulty, that Marcus had been prepared thoroughly for success, and barely at all for the kind of adversity that success eventually, inevitably, produces, about Ethan, and a different fear that his younger son had given so completely to the company that he had neglected the construction of any life that existed independently of it. One Tuesday evening in June, 4 months before he died, Raymond called Ethan into his home office. 6 weeks had passed since a second hospital, and then a third had confirmed the original diagnosis. The door closed. No folder opened, no document came from the desk. Raymond sat back in his chair and looked at Ethan for a long, quiet moment with the expression of a man who has exhausted his allocation of time for indirection. "I need to ask you something," Raymond said, "and I need you to answer honestly. Not the version you think I want, the actual truth." Ethan sat down. "If I leave this company to Marcus a controlling interest, the title, the authority over every decision, what genuinely happens to it?" Into the room the question settled and remained there. Many times across many years Ethan had turned this precise question over in his mind, not as the fantasy of a different outcome, because he had never been the kind of person who inhabited fantasies, but as a genuine analysis, because clear understanding of difficult situations was how he had always managed to function inside them without being destroyed, being asked to say the answer out loud directly. To the person who was simultaneously the author of the question and the subject of the answer, he had never anticipated that. A moment of quiet. Honestly, he grows it quickly and breaks it faster. Ethan held his father's gaze steadily. Marcus is genuinely exceptional at specific things. Acquisition, relationships, making people want to participate in something he is part of. Those are real capabilities, and they have real value. But the years between the transactions, the maintenance, the restructuring, the slow and careful attention that keeps 42 properties performing when nothing exciting or visible is happening, he has no patience for that work. Not once in 11 years. That is not a judgment. It is simply accurate. Raymond nodded. Not the nod of someone encountering new information. The nod of someone hearing confirmed, by the voice they trusted most, what they had understood privately for years, but had never found a way to act upon without a confrontation for which they lacked the necessary vocabulary. "And if the company goes to you, I protect it. I grow it more slowly than you would prefer. Fewer headlines, but in 20 years it is standing, and it is sound." Out the window at the city, Raymond looked for a long time. The silence between them was not uncomfortable to people who had spent 11 years. Communicating primarily through work, understood each other in the specific way that shared labor creates. "I have already changed the will," Raymond said eventually. "Marcus receives the controlling interest. The title, full operational authority." Ethan absorbed this, without shifting his expression. Already he had known, not from any document or disclosure, but from the deep understanding of this particular man and the particular forces that had shaped him across 70 years of living. "But I have spent the last 2 years constructing something alongside that decision." Raymond chose his next words with visible care. "A legal structure, a mechanism that functions as a circuit breaker, something embedded beneath. The inheritance that becomes relevant only if the company's leadership, begins moving in directions that would genuinely damage what 30 years of work produced. I need you to understand exactly what it is, and I need to know before I cannot ask anymore, whether you are willing to use it when the time requires it. What kind of structure? From the bottom drawer of his desk, Raymond produced a folder and placed it on the surface between them. Ethan reached across and opened the cover. Page 1. Page 2. By page 11, his hands had become completely still. By page 30, he understood the full architecture of what his father had spent 2 years quietly assembling. By page 73, the final page, carrying Raymond's signature beside a date 14 months before his death, Ethan Callaway understood something that would not become practically relevant for another 2 years. Not only a son, a creditor. What happened on the Thursday morning in September when Raymond Callaway stopped fighting? That comes first. In the house he had purchased first, not the largest property he could have afforded after 30 years of building, but the original one, in the Eastern District 3 blocks from where he had grown up. Raymond lay in the house his sons had returned to after school for 18 years. Eleanor sat beside him. David Holla had been present through the previous night. In the final hours, both sons were in the room. Marcus held his father's hand and spoke about the future of the company, the places it would go, the things it would become, the permanence of the name Raymond had built. Every word was meant sincerely. That is worth saying plainly. Ethan sat on the opposite side of the bed and said nothing. Words were the wrong instrument for that room. Once, near the very end, Raymond looked at him. A single Luke, carrying 11 years of early mornings and unannounced trust, and the specific grief of a father confronting too late, the things left unspoken for too long. Once, Ethan nodded. Raymond closed his eyes. 14 days later, the will was read in David Hale's downtown office. Precisely what Raymond had described on that Tuesday evening in June. Marcus Callaway received 61% of the voting stock of Callaway Group, the title of Chief Executive Officer, and complete operational authority over all 42 properties in the portfolio, value at time of transfer, $340 million. Ethan received a 19% minority stake, a formal advisory designation carrying no operational authority, and salary continuation for 24 months. Marcus received a kingdom. Ethan received language carefully constructed to resemble respect. Across the table, Marcus looked at his brother with an expression that was genuinely complicated, part guilt, part relief, part the particular discomfort of someone receiving something substantial they know they have not entirely earned. "We build this together," Marcus said, conviction in his voice, or conviction's shape convincingly enough that the distinction did not matter in that moment. "Nothing between us changes. You remain the most important person in that company." "Of course," Ethan said. 27 days it appeared Marcus had meant every syllable. Joint meetings, shared discussions, if not shared weight, a transition that looked to every external observer like two brothers managing grief and succession with unusual maturity and mutual care. 27 days, then the folder appeared on the boardroom table. Everything Marcus had said in David Hale's office revealed itself to be precisely what it was. Words assembled in the shape of commitment, warmth performing the function of substance, the architecture of brotherhood without its foundation. Here is what Raymond Callaway had spent 2 years building in complete and deliberate secrecy. Every property in the Callaway portfolio carried debt. This is not unusual. It is the essential mechanism of serious real estate development. Borrow to acquire, leverage existing holdings to reach the next one. Manage the debt structure carefully so that it remains a tool rather than becoming a constraint. The Callaway portfolio carried $218 million in outstanding obligations, distributed across 42 properties. Mortgages, refinancing instruments, bridge loans, construction financing, standard arrangements. Nothing unusual on the surface of any of them. Unusual, however, was the identity of the party holding that debt. In 26 months before his death, Raymond had executed a series of quiet, fully legal, meticulously documented debt assignment transactions. The properties themselves, the titles, the addresses, the physical assets appearing in the estate inventory, remained inside the estate and transferred to Marcus precisely as the will described. Every debt instrument attached to those properties had been separately and legally transferred elsewhere, to a holding company, Callaway Debt Holdings, LLC, incorporated 2 years prior, structured carefully. Documented, thoroughly. One beneficial owner named in the formation documents, Ethan James Callaway. Sit with that for a moment before moving forward. Marcus Callaway inherited 42 properties, worth $340 million. What Marcus could not determine from the inheritance documents he received, not without reading 73 pages of debt assignment filings with the focused attention of someone who had spent a decade working with these exact kinds of instruments, was that every single property in that inheritance carried significant outstanding debt owed not to a bank, not to an institutional lender, not to any third party, to his younger brother. $280 million. Documented legal Raymond's signature on every page of every instrument. Raymond had not constructed this to harm Marcus. Ethan understood that, with complete clarity from the first evening he read those pages. Punitive, it was not. Cruel, it was not. Engineering, the same careful structural thinking Raymond had applied to every problem worth solving across 30 years of building. A kingdom for Marcus, the name, the title, the authority, the watch, built into the foundation of that kingdom. Though a circuit breaker, a mechanism that would only engage if Marcus began moving in ways that endangered what 3 decades of patient construction had produced. A creditor with full legal standing, who could call the debt, restructured terms, or compel negotiation. Someone who understood every number in the portfolio, and who could not be charmed or outmaneuvered by presentation. Someone Raymond Callaway trusted without qualification. The morning after the boardroom, Ethan did not contact Marcus. The following day, no contact either. For 2 complete weeks, from every external angle, it appeared he was doing nothing at all. Home, coffee, identical process every morning. Same cup, the small ritual that had anchored the beginning of every working day for 11 years. Then to the desk in his apartment, where he had worked through countless late evenings, and a spreadsheet opened. Not from anger. Not from any developed strategy. From the same instinct that had made him effective for 11 years. When something required understanding, you built the model. Mapped every element, worked through the numbers until the situation became legible. Every property in the Callaway portfolio mapped completely. Current valuations. Outstanding balances on every debt instrument. Interest rates, maturity dates, default triggers, cross-referenced against the assignment documents from the folder Raymond had placed on his desk 14 months earlier. 3 distinct scenarios constructed: immediate debt call, full renegotiation of terms, continuation of current status, with detailed projections on each, until the outcome ranges tightened to something precise and actionable. At the end of 2 weeks, a financial model accounting for every dollar in the Callaway Group portfolio sat on that desk, complete. Verified. Down to the last clause of the last footnote, 1 letter followed. 4 paragraphs, addressed not to Marcus, but to David Halley, formally and on the record, in the specific legal language Section 7 of the assignment agreements required. Formally notified, Ethan Callaway, as beneficial owner of Callaway Debt Holdings, LLC, was invoking his rights as creditor under the terms of the original debt instruments, and requesting a complete accounting meeting within 30 days, as specified under the assignment agreement terms. Registered mail on a Monday morning. Marcus received a copy Thursday. 1 line in that letter Marcus read 4 times. Not the legal invocation language, not the formal creditor designation. 1 sentence in the 3rd paragraph, positioned almost incidentally, almost as an aside to the letter's legal purpose, that communicated something about his younger brother that 30 years of proximity had never made visible. Before this story concludes, you will know what that sentence said. Marcus's reaction reached Ethan through their cousin James, who had been in the outer office when the envelope arrived. The letter was read completely. Set down, lifted again. 2nd time, 3rd time, 4th time. Then, very quietly, to the room. What is Callaway Debt Holdings? Nobody answered. Nobody knew. 3 attorneys Marcus reached before David Halley picked up. The first to each offered variations of the same assessment. Without the underlying documents they could not provide. Specific guidance. But debt assignment was an established legal mechanism, and properly executed instruments carried very limited basis for challenge. By the time Haley answered, Marcus had assembled enough of the picture to recognize the shape of his problem. The full dimensions had not yet arrived. David, his voice, James reported later, had lost every trace of its practiced even. Tell me this is not what I think it is. A pause. Marcus, Haley said carefully, your father was a very thorough man. Smooth. That was how Marcus had believed the transition would be. Wrong in ways he had not anticipated. The first week revealed something he had not prepared for. Ethan's departure was not the departure of one person. An operating system had walked out the door, institutional memory, relationship networks, and the specific knowledge that never appears in any document because the person who carries it never imagines a day when they will not be present to apply it directly. October's final week brought the first concrete problem. Building Siete Northern District, commercial property. The anchor tenant had submitted a lease renewal notice dated November 1st. 4 months of active negotiation had preceded this. Ethan's negotiation. The relationship with that specific tenant involved an understanding never committed to paper, held between two people who had built enough trust to operate that way. Rate flexibility in exchange for long-term commitment. This particular tenant was not merely a revenue line. Their occupancy attracted other tenants. Their departure would cost significantly more than their monthly rent. None of this context existed anywhere in any file the new team had access to. Standard renewal terms were submitted. The tenant exercised their termination option. Building 7 was vacant by December. Into the conference room Marcus assembled his team and requested a detailed account of what had occurred. A junior analyst capable, new, 3 months into his tenure, produced a spreadsheet displaying the tenant's revenue contribution against comparable market rates. Their profile was average. The analyst offered, we have capacity to attract stronger tenants. The spreadsheet received a long look from Marcus. Then, the window. Something in him. Some layer that had absorbed 30 years of watching his father build this thing. Understood that this answer was insufficient. Ethan would not have described the situation this way. In Ethan's framework, the phrase attract stronger tenants was not a sentence, but a multi-year process. And arriving at it this quickly signaled a fundamental misunderstanding of how the residential and commercial division actually functioned. Precisely what to say in its place, Marcus did not know. So he said nothing that mattered. Start a new listing process. The meeting ended. That night, he remained at his desk until nearly midnight with Building 7's file open in front of him, trying to reconstruct the last time Ethan had reviewed it and what he would have seen there. December brought the second problem. A refinancing arrangement on the company's most significant commercial holding, 14 months in development. Central Bank. A relationship Ethan had cultivated across 7 years of consistent, direct engagement, reached its maturity date. Under the conditions Ethan had established, the rollover would have been routine. The bank relationship was solid. The terms were mutually acceptable. The history between the parties was extensive. The relationship, however, belonged to Ethan specifically, not to Callaway Group as an entity, to the person who had called that particular banker on Tuesday mornings for 7 years, who had written a recommendation for the banker's son's graduate school application, who understood which issues to surface proactively and which to allow the bank to discover independently. Marcus's team arranged the call. Professionally courteous, the banker was. A meeting was scheduled. Revised terms arrived at that meeting. Higher rates, tighter covenants. These reflect current market conditions, the banker said, without elaboration, without apology. The terms were contested. The banker listened attentively, indicated he would consult his credit committee, and followed up 3 weeks later with an offer marginally less favorable than the one they had rejected. Alternative financing came through a separate institution. The deal closed. The company remained technically stable. Cost differential from Ethan's original terms, $2.1 million. The monetary value of 7 years of relationship maintenance, irreplaceable in 7 weeks, regardless of the capability of the replacement team. That evening Marcus entered his father's old office for the first time since receiving the inheritance. The room carried a weight he had not known how to inhabit, a presence belonging to someone who was no longer there to fill it. Raymond's chair received him. Clear was the desk's surface, organized and emptied of the personal items Raymond had accumulated across decades. Hale's office had handled that quietly during the estate transfer process. Center drawer, empty. Side drawer, also empty. Bottom drawer and along the back panel, taped there with tape gone brown and stiff with age, nearly flush with the wood, a single index card in Raymond Calloway's handwriting. 2 lines. What you build is not what you own. What you protect is what you leave behind. Twice, Marcus read the card. Long in that silence, he sat. Then he returned the card carefully to its position, closed the drawer, and went back to work. While Marcus spent 60 days in emergency consultations with 3 separate law firms, Ethan registered a company, Meridian Property Group. November 3rd, 40 days after the boardroom, personal, capital, $2.3 million. 11 years of salary and bonuses accumulated by someone whose working hours had not left much space for spending. Direct relationships with every significant lender in the city, developed across a decade of being the person those lenders actually negotiated with when Marcus was traveling or attending the kind of event that produces photographs rather than closed transactions. David Hawley, who had quietly made himself available for independent counsel once the conflict of interest at Calloway had become structurally unmanageable, and something no document could record. 11 years of granular market knowledge, which specific assets were trading below their actual value, which neighborhoods were in the early phase of transitions that had not yet registered in published data, which sellers were motivated by circumstances unrelated to the property, which opportunities looked like problems to the market and looked like straightforward solutions to someone patient enough to work through the surface layer. That knowledge had been constructed over 11 years inside the walls of Calloway Group. Out of those walls, it departed the same morning Ethan did. Meridian's first acquisition was a 16-unit residential complex in the Eastern District, undervalued, poorly managed, the kind of asset that reads as a problem to anyone oriented toward quick results and reads as a straightforward opportunity to anyone willing to spend adequate time understanding what the actual problem consists of. 31 days to close the transaction. No dinner, no announcement, no coverage. The management structure was addressed. Service contracts renegotiated, pricing corrected on 2 units that had sat vacant for months due to an error the previous management had not identified, and attention moved to the next opportunity. 8 weeks later, the second acquisition followed. A commercial building 2 blocks from Calloway Tower, a building Ethan had passed on his way into work every morning for 11 years. Vacant for 14 months. Every prospective tenant who had advanced to due diligence had withdrawn after encountering a structural ambiguity in the original lease framework, a drafting error, creating genuine legal uncertainty around maintenance responsibility that made long-term commitment feel imprudent. 3 years earlier, Ethan had identified this specific problem. Once, briefly, he had mentioned it to Marcus as a property worth monitoring when the vacancy discount brought the price into range. Marcus had nodded and moved to the following agenda item. Independently, Ethan purchased the building. 3 years, he had understood the lease problem. And during that time, he had already worked through the precise restructuring it required. Corrected in a week, a signed anchor tenant followed within 30 days of closing. March brought the third acquisition, a warehouse in the Southern Industrial Zone. Most investors avoided that area because market reports described it as transitioning, which in real estate language means direction unclear. Ethan's direction was not unclear. 3 years earlier, reading City Council zoning meeting minutes, as part of his standard research process, he had encountered a single line item, approval of a light rail extension passing directly through this specific zone, scheduled to open in 2026. That line had not surfaced in any private market analysis he had encountered before or since. The connection between that infrastructure decision and the value of specific blocks of industrial property required reading source documents rather than summary reports. Source documents were what Ethan read. $1.8 million for the warehouse. No announcement, no discussion of the rationale. 4 years later, it would carry a market value of $6.2 million, situated 2 blocks from the completed station entrance. Keys collected on the day the transaction closed, placed in his jacket pocket, back to the car, next address entered. The fourth acquisition almost failed to occur. A mixed-use building in the downtown corridor, ground floor commercial, residential floors above, held by an estate whose 3 heirs were motivated sellers. The building's condition had ended every prior conversation. Aging roof, outdated plumbing, HVAC system 3 years past its scheduled replacement. Together, those issues had cleared the field of competing buyers. 3 separate visits to the property. First, alone. Then, with his contractor. Then, on a weeknight evening, with a flashlight, descending to the basement to examine the one element no inspection report had specifically addressed. Solid was the foundation, not merely adequate, genuinely sound, the kind of structural base that supports buildings significantly older than this one continuing to stand. Every problem above it was either cosmetic or replaceable. The thing that cannot be corrected after acquisition, the element underneath everything else, was not a problem. His structural engineer confirmed this assessment. $400,000 to $450,000 in renovation costs. 7 to 8 months, depending on permit timing. $2.1 million for the building. Renovation came to $430,000. 9 months after closing, the property was fully occupied. Commercial floor leased to a restaurant group on a 10-year term. Residential units renting at premium rates for the neighborhood. Total investment, $2.53 million. Current value, $4.8 million. No article, no acknowledgement, nobody watching. The 5th transaction kept him awake, not from anxiety, but from a quality of engagement he had not felt in a long time, without something underneath it. A historic building from the 1920s, heritage designated in the city's oldest commercial corridor. Heritage status reliably drives away buyers because of renovation restrictions and associated cost premiums. 2 days on research. Heritage renovation grants available through the city, a federal incentive program for qualifying historic structures located through Federal Register filings. A program known to perhaps 3 active participants in this local market. Tax structures applicable when both programs were combined. That combination reduced the effective acquisition cost from a $2.4 million list price to just under $800,000. Awake that night, Ethan lay not because anything was wrong. The problem was interesting. The solution was elegant. This work belonged entirely to himself, and the feeling that produced had no mixed quality in it. No undercurrent of someone else's name on the outcome. No subtle awareness that the credit would land somewhere other than where the work had been done. Just the numbers. Just the problem. Just his. December brought the closing. On the final day of his first year, Ethan opened the Meridian portfolio spreadsheet. 7 properties. $34 million in combined value. Constructed in 12 months from $2.3 million in starting capital, built entirely from the knowledge and relationships that had walked out of the Callaway building with him on October 14th. Longy looked at that number. Briefly, he thought about the $340 million portfolio he had left behind. Then the spreadsheet closed, and preparation began for the following morning. $34 million in which every figure belonged to him entirely felt larger in the ways that actually matter than $340 million had ever felt. Meanwhile, the Callaway Group was discovering the specific cost of removing the person who understood how it actually worked. Within 4 months of Ethan's departure, the residential portfolio 61 properties, 11 years of patient construction, began showing measurable strain. Occupancy rates declined across multiple properties. 2 major commercial tenants exercised early termination clauses. The identical clauses, Ethan had flagged his elevated risk in a written memo 8 months prior that Marcus had confirmed receiving and not acted upon. The central bank refinancing collapsed, as described. A second refinancing arrangement on the hotel portfolio, less visible but structurally important, required emergency renegotiation at terms significantly worse than Ethan would have accepted. Board members began raising questions at quarterly meetings that prior years had not required. 2 institutional investors holding a combined 14% of non-voting equity requested urgent briefings and came away from those meetings less settled than when they arrived. Projections and presentations answered everything from Marcus, delivered with the quality of projected confidence that had always performed well in rooms where the underlying numbers had not yet begun, actively contradicting the presentation. Numbers do not perform indefinitely. 14 months after the boardroom, on a Wednesday afternoon, Ethan's phone rang. Unknown number. Nearly, he ignored it. Is this Ethan Callaway? A woman's voice, deliberate, carrying the slight tension of someone who has prepared the first sentence of a conversation they were uncertain they should be initiating. It is. This is Sandra Reeves. A moment of quiet. Sandra Reeves, senior partner, 11 years at Callaway Group. One of the 43 people present in the boardroom on October 14th, when a folder had traveled 40 feet of marble and nobody had spoken. Almost a decade of working alongside Sandra, not a person who made unnecessary calls. The fact of the call itself was already a signal. "I am not calling to ask for anything," she said immediately. "I want to be clear about that before anything else. I am not seeking a favor or positioning myself or attempting to make circumstances easier for anyone who has not earned easier." "Then why are you calling?" "Because I was in that room, and I said nothing." Her voice held its steadiness at some effort. "I have spent 14 months with that fact. Every week I have told myself there was nothing I could have done that would have changed what Marcus had already decided. Every week that argument has become slightly less convincing. And because the company your father built is under serious pressure, and I think you should have the specific details rather than the version that is being managed externally. Everything Ethan had been holding was set down. Tell me. 40 minutes. What Sandra described across those 40 minutes was an organization under compounding stresses that its current internal structure lacked the architecture to address. 3 board members were exploring governance alternatives, quietly enough that Marcus had not yet registered the conversations as a pattern. The 2 institutional investors, representing 14% of the non-voting equity, had each requested emergency briefings and had come away from those meetings less reassured than Marcus's team had anticipated or reported internally. The residential portfolio's occupancy rate had declined 11% against the prior year average. Not a crisis in isolation, but a trend line that, if it continued at its current rate, would reach crisis range within 12 to 18 months without structural intervention. "There is something else," Sandra said. After a pause, Isan waited. "The team Marcus brought in as capable. I want to say that plainly because it is true and because I think you should know I am not simply criticizing the replacement. Genuinely skilled people, but they are operating from a starting deficit that I do not believe Marcus fully understands. The knowledge base that kept this company stable for 11 years was not in any file or system. It was in one person, and that person walked out the door in October. You cannot hire a replacement for institutional memory that was built across a decade. You can only wait for the new team to rebuild it. And that process takes years. And a company can absorb a great deal of damage in the interim." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your father spent 30 years building something that was genuinely real," Sandra said, "and I am unwilling to watch it become something smaller because of decisions made in a boardroom on a Tuesday morning that I could have contested and chose not to." A pause. "I am not asking you to come back. I am not asking you to do anything in particular. I am telling you because you are the person who should know, and nobody else was going to make this call." A moment of quiet. He was thinking about a Tuesday evening in June. A closed door. A folder. A question asked, with no time remaining for anything but the honest answer. "I appreciate the call, Sandra." 3 full days. That was how long Ethan sat with everything she had described. Not processing it emotionally, but examining it from every relevant angle. The way he approached any situation requiring a decision, he thought about what his father had built. He thought about the index card in the bottom drawer of Raymond's desk that Marcus had found and probably not known what to do with. He thought about 30 families living somewhere better because a man had seen past the surface of a deteriorating building on a Saturday morning and understood what it could become. Then David Halle received a call. One specific request made, not aggressive, not structured, as an opening move in a conflict. One request, stated plainly, that Halle agreed to without hesitation. That request initiated the sequence that would bring both brothers into the same room again. 18 months after a folder had moved across 40 feet of Italian marble, with the weight on a different side of the table. Before that meeting, one more thing. 11 years old, Ethan was. Marcus, 14. On a Saturday morning, Raymond took both of them to see a property he was evaluating, an old apartment building in the Eastern District, the same neighborhood where Raymond had grown up. Weathered, the building was, a crack running diagonally across the lower front step. paint peeling from the window frames in long, thin strips. "This place is in terrible condition," Baba Marcus said. Raymond said nothing. Ethan looked at the building for a moment. Then at his father. Then at the building again, differently the second time, in the specific way you look at something when you stop reacting to its surface and begin reading what lies underneath. Italiano, "How many families live here?" 30, Raymond said, "and if you repair it properly, then 30 families live somewhere better." Raymond paused briefly. "And we operate a better business." Marcus had already walked back toward the car. 3 more minutes, Ethan stood on that sidewalk, looking at the building without moving. That moment at 11 years old, on a cracked sidewalk in the Eastern District, was when Ethan Calloway first understood the difference between looking at something and actually seeing it. Marcus saw what things were. Ethan saw what they could become. 30 years later, in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a downtown law firm, with $280 million documented across 3 binders on the table between them, that distinction was still the entire story. Neutral territory, the conference room on the 22nd floor of a downtown law firm. Hole had proposed it. Ethan had agreed without discussion because the location was not the variable that mattered. First, to arrive. As always, coffee ordered. Position taken with his back to the window. Not for any psychological calculation, but because he had spent 30 years watching his father demonstrate that the person who arrives early and settles quietly has already communicated something consequential before anyone else has spoken a word. Raymond had said it once, plainly. During a site visit when Ethan was 22, the negotiation begins the moment you enter the building. Everything before the first word is already information. Ethan had never forgotten that. 7 minutes after the scheduled time, Marcus arrived. 2 attorneys accompanied him. Older, he looked in the precise way that sustained internal pressure produces aging lines deepening around the eyes, a subtle tightening through the jaw, an alertness that had been shaded over time into something closer to wariness. Excellent suit, composed posture. Significant preparation had clearly gone into this meeting, and it showed in the controlled quality of every movement. Their father's watch was on his wrist. Ethan noted it, without expression. Directly across from his brother, Marcus sat. The room held a long silence. Not uncomfortable, not charged with hostility, but carrying the particular weight of 2 people who have not shared the same physical space in 18 months, and who are each in their own way what they are now looking at across the table. Attorneys organized their documents on both sides. The first of 3 binders, Hale opened with deliberate calm, the way a person opens something when they want everyone in the room to understand that what it contains has been prepared with complete "You did not need to do this through attorneys," Marcus said. Level voice. Controlled. The practiced evenness had returned, but underneath it was something that had not been there before. A quality of genuine attention, as though he was listening to the room more carefully than he used to. "You ended 11 years through a folder," Ethan replied. Attorneys seemed proportionate. Marcus held that for a moment. Down at the table surface, he looked and said nothing further. Hale began. 2 hours followed, not a confrontation in any dramatic sense. No raised voices, no visible anger, no exchange of the kind that makes for compelling recounting in a certain style of narrative on accounting. Precise and complete. Every debt instrument in documented sequence. Property by property, working through the portfolio in the same geographic and chronological order in which the original acquisition records had been filed. Outstanding principal on each instrument. Accrued interest to the current date maturity. Default trigger provisions. The full range of legal remedies available to the creditor, Ethan, under each individual instrument and under the master assignment agreement governing the entire collection. Exact without being theatrical. No editorializing, no looking at either brother during the presentation, except when directing a specific question to one of the attorneys on either side. 22 years of practice had built in Hale a particular capability, translating complicated and uncomfortable circumstances into unavoidable ones. Applied here without any departure from his characteristic manner. When Hale finished, the room was quiet. The total figure had been sitting at the center of the table for the duration of the presentation, visible to everyone, acknowledged by no one until this moment. $218 million. Marcus's attorneys conferred in voices calibrated not to carry to the other side of the table. Marcus himself had gone completely still. The particular stillness Ethan had seen in his father once, years ago, in a negotiation that had reached the moment where every piece of information was on the table, and the only remaining question was what would be done with it. Long he looked at the number. Long he looked at the 3 binders, then directly at Ethan. For the first time since the meeting had properly begun. What do you want? 80 months of preparation, 3 separate written answers, composed at the same desk, reviewed, and discarded. One answer remaining because it was the only one that was actually true. The residential division, Ethan said. Complete transfer, clean title, the debt attached to those specific 61 properties forgiven as the agreed consideration for the transfer. Level throughout. His voice remained without any deliberate effort to keep it that way. Everything remaining. The commercial holdings, the hotel portfolio, the industrial land, stays with you, with restructured debt terms that are equitable and provide adequate runway to stabilize the company properly. Across the table, Marcus studied his brother with an expression that was difficult to read, not guarded, not calculating, something closer to genuinely trying to understand. You keep Callaway Group. You keep the name your father spent 30 years building. A pause. You keep the watch. Down briefly at his wrist, Marcus looked. And between the two of us, we are finished, not as adversaries. Simply finished. Silence occupied the room. One of Marcus's attorneys shifted slightly in his chair but said nothing. That is the complete request? That is everything. Another silence. Why not take the entire portfolio? The legal standing is unambiguous. Ethan held his brother's gaze. Not with aggression, not with a performance of magnanimity, with the simple steadiness of someone saying aloud something they have known to be true for a long time. Because our father did not spend 30 years constructing that company so that one of his sons could be used as an instrument to destroy the other. He built it because he wanted to leave something genuinely real behind in the world, something that would outlast him and mean something after he was gone. He held Marcus's eyes. I was never interested in destroying you. That has never been what this was. I was simply not willing to disappear. That was the line. Third paragraph of the original letter sent to David Halle on a Monday morning, 18 months prior. One sentence, positioned almost as an aside within the formal legal language surrounding it, that Marcus had read 4 times in his outer office, while James watched from across the room. I was not willing to disappear. 8 words. In 38 years of knowing his brother, Marcus had never heard Ethan say anything that carried that direct acclaim about himself. 11 years of demonstration, every early morning, every late evening, every problem quietly resolved before it became visible, every sacrifice made without accounting but never once stated as a right he was prepared to assert on his own behalf. Sitting across that table, Marcus arrived at something he had not reached before. Not a realization exactly, more an acknowledgement of something he had been positioned to see for years, and had not looked at squarely. 11 years he had spent interpreting his brother's silence as an absence. Ethan had not been absent. Present in a way Marcus had not learned to recognize, waiting with the patience of someone who had spent his entire career understanding that the most important things take time and that forcing them early ruins them. Marcus looked at his lead attorney. What came back was a nearly imperceptible nod. The professional confirmation that the terms as stated were within the range of what could be accepted. 2 weeks to review the complete documentation. You have it, Ethan replied. Up, he stood, middle button first, then lower, the way Raymond had shown him at 14, to the door without hurry. This time, he did not register the sound of it closing behind him. Already he was thinking about the morning after the agreement was signed. 17 days later, the agreement was executed. Ethan received the residential division's 61 properties, carrying a combined value of $124 million. In a complete, legal transfer. The debt attached to those properties was forgiven as the negotiated consideration for the transfer. The remaining Callaway portfolio continued under Marcus with restructured debt terms, providing 18 months of operational stability and a credible path toward recovery. One text message Sandra Reeves sent the morning the paperwork was confirmed. Your father would have understood this. Twice, he read it. Then his phone went into his jacket pocket, and the car pulled out toward the first property visit of the morning. Triumphant. He did not feel. That is worth saying clearly because triumph is what this kind of story is supposed to produce. The clean emotional payoff. The vindication landing exactly where it was aimed, pulling out of the parking structure into the morning traffic. What Ethan felt was something quieter and more durable than triumph. He felt like himself. Not the version of himself that had spent 11 years being useful to someone else's company. Not the version that had built things and watched other people accept the credit in rooms he was not invited to enter. The actual version. The one that saw what things could become rather than what they currently were. The one that understood a foundation before he understood a facade. The one that had learned on a cracked sidewalk at 11 years old that looking and seeing are entirely different activities. Present the entire time. That version had been never disappeared. Simply waiting for the right conditions to become fully visible. Marcus stabilized the Callaway Group across the following 2 years, with the restructured terms and an operational partner who understood the unglamorous interior work the way Ethan always had. The company survived. Growth was slower than Raymond had once imagined, but the thing remained standing, which is what Raymond had actually cared about most when the final accounting came. Sandra Reeves joined Meridian as a senior partner in the second year. She did not ask for forgiveness, and Ethan did not offer any commentary on what had or had not been forgiven. Work followed instead, which was the right answer and the one he had expected from her. 4 years in Meridian Property Group reached $200 million in portfolio value. On the morning that milestone was confirmed in the quarterly report, Ethan sat at the same desk in the same apartment where he had built the spreadsheet 40 days after the boardroom. Longy looked at the number. Then the laptop closed, and the day's first site visit began. The work continued. The work always continued. That, in the end, was the entire point. One thing I did not tell you at the beginning of this story, Raymond Callaway changed his will twice. The Second Amendment, executed 9 days before he died, is the reason Ethan never had to use the debt documents at all. Watch the next video. It will change how you understand everything you just heard.